How would you like to make endless copies of your favorite tomato plants? Or better yet, create an immortal tomato, one that never dies? Well, join me today as I show you how to clone tomatoes. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and cloning tomatoes does not require any specific scientific knowledge. It doesn't require laboratory equipment. It's incredibly easy and something that every gardener can do. And I love these tomatoes, and I would like more of these tomatoes, and I would like to grow these tomatoes well into the future. Cloning or vegetative propagation is the way to do it. I'm just going to take cuttings. I'm going to take portions of these plants, and they'll grow into completely new tomato plants. The reason this is so easy with tomatoes is because of the way that tomato plants grow. When you have a leaf branch and the main stem, at that junction you can expect a sucker to develop. Leaf branch, stem, here's a sucker. Leaf branch, stem, here's another little sucker. If left on the plant, those suckers or side shoots will continue to grow, and they will also produce more suckers. If you remove those suckers from the plant, they have the capability of growing into a completely new and complete tomato plant. And that's what we're doing with the cloning process. Removing the suckers, allowing them to root and then grow and give us an identical plant to the one that we removed it from. Periodically, it's a good idea to prune your tomato plants so that they don't go crazy and take over a space, so that you can increase air circulation and cut down on the possibility of fungal and bacterial diseases, and for the possibility of having more plants through the vegetative propagation and cloning. The primary part of the plant that we remove in pruning is the sucker. We have the leaf branch, we have the main stem, and then we have a sucker. All we have to do is cut it. There are three basic methods that we can use to take this side shoot and turn it into a whole brand new tomato plant. With the first method, all you do is grab a jar, put some water in it. You can cut off any lower side branches, and then you simply take this sucker and put it into the jar of water. The second method is to take a pot with some moist potting soil, open up a little hole in the center, and stick the sucker in. And then firm up the soil around the sucker. This third method may be the easiest of all. We identify the sucker on the plant, cut it off, pinch off or prune off any lower branches, dig a hole in the same bed, drop the sucker in, compact the soil around it, and this will grow into a whole new tomato plant. In the pot or the bed, the very first thing you want to do is water the plants. Get the soil nice and saturated around this side shoot or sucker. As soon as you remove that sucker and then expose it to very moist conditions, the genetics of the tomato plant begin to take over. It wants to survive. And it's not the little hairs on the stem that grow into roots, it's adventitious cells. And those cells, when exposed to that moisture, will begin to grow. After about a week, roots are going to develop all along the stem that's either in the water or buried in moist soil. The water in the jar does a good job of allowing those roots to grow. To get the biggest and healthiest roots, you might want to add a little bit of compost tea or worm tea or diluted fertilizer to the water. For the pots or the beds, you don't need to add any additional nutrients, but you do need to keep this soil moist the entire time these plants are growing. These methods of cloning tomatoes can be done at any time during the growing season. For gardeners who either can't start their own seeds or maybe can only start a few tomato plants, but yet they've got a lot of room to grow plants, this might be a good way to just start 1 or 2 plants from seed, or maybe just buy a couple plants from the nursery, and then use this vegetative propagation to grow more and more and more plants to fill out your garden beds. When you think about it, this is a fast way to grow a lot of tomato plants. When you start tomatoes from seed, it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks minimum to get a plant that's big enough to transplant in the garden. But when you take a sucker and put it into soil or into water and then to soil, after just 2 or 3 weeks, you have a plant that's actively growing with a pretty robust root system. Now, you do need to make sure that you are choosing that side shoot or that sucker to grow your new plant. If you prune off one of these leaf branches, it's not going to develop into a full plant. In fact, it's probably going to shrivel up and die pretty soon. You need to make sure that you have the sucker that has a growing tip. It's the growing tip. It's where the new leaves and branches develop that allows this to grow into a complete new tomato plant. And when you understand that it's that growing tip that continues to grow and develop in indeterminate tomatoes, that's how you can make your tomato plant immortal. With this trellis that I love to use, close to the end of the season, all of my plants will be this tall, and I'll start topping the plants. I'll begin cutting off those growing tips. If I save those growing tips in pots of soil or beds in the greenhouse, I can keep the plants growing through the winter. Now, you do need to give the tomato plants the conditions they need to grow. If they're exposed to any freezing temperatures, they'll die. I have some tomato plants growing in my greenhouse. My greenhouse does not have supplemental heating, so it will get below freezing and these plants will die. So for me, once I pot up those top shoots or those suckers at the end of the season, I'll need to either heat my greenhouse or grow those in pots inside where I can give them the warmth that they need. There is no limit to the number of times you can clone a single tomato plant. If you have a very short winter, you might be able to top your tomato plant, take that cutting, put it into a pot of potting mix, grow it for a couple months, and then transplant it into your garden for a very early start with your favorite tomato plant. For some of us with very long winters, a tomato in a pot indoors will just get too big before I would be able to transplant it into my garden the following season. But during the time it's growing indoors, I can continue to take cuttings from that plant and pot them up. The first plant might be too big. I can throw it in the compost pile, but now each of those generations of potted plants will continue to grow. It might be 2 or 3 generations underneath my grow lights, but as soon as the growing season starts, I can take them, put them into my garden, and they'll start growing into the same plant that I took the cuttings from. You should treat these suckers that you're putting into your garden beds just like any other seedling that you would transplant during summer. Try to avoid doing it during the heat of the day. Wait until it's not as hot outside, or do it on an overcast day. Ideally, plan to use some shade cloth or some type of sun protection over the suckers that go directly into the ground. You can expect that they're going to wilt, and you want to keep that to a minimum. Putting the suckers into the pots can be a really good idea because you can move those pots into sheltered areas while the roots are developing. And you take those plants out of the water in the jar, you need to think about hardening them off first. So either putting them into pots first or into a sheltered part of your garden bed will help ensure success. Whichever method you use, imagine that you finally find a tomato plant that does great in your garden, and you can grow the exact plant year after year. Now, there are other things to consider when growing tomatoes, so watch one of these videos next to learn more. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.